Millionaire CEO needs a date to his ex's wedding. He picks a random girl and can't stop staring. He needed a fake date to survive his ex's wedding. But when he picked a random girl from a corner deli, he had no idea she'd be the one to change everything. Not just the night, but his heart. Please don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel as a sign of support. The morning sun peeked through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Jordan Hayes' Manhattan penthouse. He sipped his black coffee, half listening to the financial news on the TV while checking emails on his phone. His assistant had already flagged the day's priorities: board meeting at 10, investor call at 2, and a charity gala that evening. Everything was running like clockwork, until he saw it. A sleek white envelope stood out from the pile of mail his doorman had dropped off. His name, Jordan Hayes, was handwritten in perfect cursive. Curious, he slid a finger under the seal and pulled out a thick, linen-textured card. "You are cordially invited to the wedding of Claire Bennett and Ryan Whitmore." Jordan stared at the names, heart clenching unexpectedly. Claire. His Claire. They had dated for 6 years, built dreams of a future, traveled the world together, even named their future kids in jest. But their paths diverged. Claire wanted a quieter life. Kids, a home in the suburbs, Sunday dinners. Jordan was chasing billion-dollar valuations and high-rise office spaces. They broke up amicably, but the ache had lingered. Now she was marrying someone else, and she'd invited him, maybe to show there were no hard feelings, or maybe to flaunt how she'd moved on. Jordan dropped the card onto the granite countertop and rubbed his temple. Going would be torture. Not going would look like cowardice. He couldn't show up alone. Not to that. He needed a date. Someone who wouldn't ask questions. Someone with no ties to the corporate world or his past. Someone who wouldn't turn it into a spectacle. Later that afternoon, as Jordan walked down West 26th Street on his way to a business lunch, he spotted a young woman sitting outside a corner deli. Her clothes were clean but worn, and her sign simply read, "Looking for work? Anything helps." God bless, what caught his eye wasn't the sign, it was her eyes. Clear, determined, and oddly serene. People passed by without a second glance, but she met his gaze steadily. Jordan hesitated, then approached. "Hi, I'm not sure how to say this without sounding insane, but I need a date. To a wedding. This weekend." The woman blinked, then gave a soft laugh. "That's a new one. I'll cover everything. Dress, travel, food. You just have to come with me. Pretend to be my date. You'd be helping me out of a very awkward situation." She studied him carefully. "You don't even know my name." "You're right," he said, extending a hand. "I'm Jordan. Mallory. Mallory Carter." "Well, Mallory, what do you say?" She hesitated, then smiled. "What's the worst that could happen?" Jordan didn't have an answer, but somehow he couldn't stop staring. Jordan wasn't entirely sure what he expected when Mallory said yes, but the woman who showed up at his building the next morning wasn't it. She arrived with a modest duffel bag and the same quiet confidence she had on the sidewalk. Dressed in jeans and a faded sweatshirt, she looked completely out of place in the marble lobby of the Hayes Tower. The doorman gave her a skeptical glance before letting her in. Jordan met her in the private lounge off the main lobby. He stood up when she entered, phone in hand but attention fully captured. "I wasn't sure you'd show," he said, motioning for her to sit. Mallory shrugged. "I figured it'd be a good story either way. Besides, I could use the change of scenery." He smiled, genuinely amused. "You're about to get one." He had arranged for a stylist and personal shopper to meet them at a high-end boutique on Fifth Avenue. The ride in his black Escalade was quiet at first, but Mallory didn't seem intimidated. She stared out the window like she was taking in every detail of the city. "So," she finally said, "what's the story here? Why ask a complete stranger?" Jordan considered lying, but something about her made him tell the truth. "My ex is getting married. I didn't want to show up alone. I didn't want to bring someone from work who'd gossip about it later. I saw you and I don't know. You look like you wouldn't care who I am." Mallory laughed. "You're not wrong." The stylist, a sharp-eyed woman named Ava, was waiting for them at the boutique. She raised an eyebrow at Mallory's attire but said nothing. Within minutes, she was pulling dresses from racks and pairing them with heels and accessories that cost more than most people's rent. Mallory tried on gown after gown, each more stunning than the last. She emerged in a navy blue off-the-shoulder dress, and Jordan felt his throat tighten. She looked breathtaking. Mallory noticed his expression and smirked. "Too much?" "No," Jordan said a little too quickly. "You look amazing." They finalized the outfit and headed to a salon for hair and makeup. Mallory remained calm, even as stylists flitted around her like butterflies. By the time they were done, she barely recognized herself in the mirror. Back at Jordan's penthouse, they went over the plan. "The wedding's in Charleston. We fly out tomorrow morning. You'll be introduced as my girlfriend. No need to overdo it. Just smile, nod, and enjoy the open bar." Mallory nodded slowly. "You're sure this is what you want?" "I'm sure," Jordan replied, but he wasn't sure why his chest tightened every time she smiled. That night, he found himself thinking less about Claire's wedding and more about the stranger sleeping in his guest room. She was supposed to be a prop in his plan, so why did he keep wondering who she really was? The private jet touched down in Charleston just after noon. Mallory stared out the window in quiet amazement, the sunlight glinting off the marshlands below. She'd never flown before, definitely not like this. The plush leather seats, the catered breakfast, the silence between them. It all felt like a surreal dream. Jordan glanced over at her as she watched the scenery. "You okay?" "Yeah," she said, turning to him. "I'm just trying to figure out how I went from begging for job flyers outside a deli to riding on a millionaire's jet to a wedding I wasn't invited to." He smirked. "Life's weird sometimes." At the airport, a black SUV awaited them, whisking them off to the elegant resort where the wedding party was staying. The reception was tomorrow, but Claire and her fiancé were hosting a welcome dinner that evening. Mallory's nerves started to kick in. "Remind me again," she asked, adjusting her sunglasses as they pulled up to the gates. "Why I agreed to pretend to be your girlfriend in front of your ex?" Jordan gave her a sidelong look. "Because I asked nicely, and because you're curious." She smiled despite herself. Guilty. The Belmont Resort was the kind of place you only saw in magazines. Long porches, rocking chairs, trees draped in Spanish moss. Staff rushed out to take their bags, and a concierge handed them chilled lemonade as they checked in. Their suite overlooked the water. It had 2 bedrooms and a sitting area, but it was clear from the looks they got at check-in that the staff assumed they were a couple. Mallory stepped onto the balcony and took a deep breath. "This place is something else." Jordan joined her, loosening his tie. "I thought it might make the weekend a little more tolerable." A few hours later, Mallory emerged from her room in a simple but elegant dress. Her hair was curled loosely over her shoulders, and her makeup was soft and natural. She didn't look like the girl from the sidewalk. She didn't even look like someone trying to fit in. She looked like she belonged. Jordan stared for a beat too long. "What?" she asked, tugging at her dress self-consciously. "Nothing, just, you clean up better than I expected." She raised an eyebrow. "I'll pretend that's a compliment." The welcome dinner was held on the resort's back lawn under a canopy of twinkle lights. Jazz music played in the background, and servers passed around champagne and oysters. Mallory stayed close to Jordan, smiling politely as he introduced her to old friends, investors, and distant relatives. Then came the moment Jordan had been dreading. Claire appeared. She wore a flowing white dress, laughing as she moved through the crowd with her fiancé. Her eyes found Jordan's, and then shifted to Mallory. For a moment, something flickered there. Jealousy? Curiosity. Claire walked over, all southern charm and rehearsed sweetness. "Jordan, I'm so glad you came." He nodded stiffly. "Claire, you look happy. And you brought a date." "Hi, I'm Claire." Mallory smiled and extended her hand. "Mallory Carter. It's a pleasure." Claire smiled back, but her grip was tight. "Isn't she lovely, Jordan? You always did have good taste." As Claire turned away, Mallory leaned in and whispered, "Was that a compliment or a threat?" Jordan chuckled. "With Claire, it's always both." The morning of the wedding dawned warm and bright. Charleston's gentle breeze carried the scent of salt and magnolia through the open windows of the suite. Mallory stood barefoot on the balcony, sipping coffee from a porcelain cup like she belonged to this world of old money and southern elegance. Inside, Jordan was pacing. He'd barely slept. Not because of the wedding, though he kept telling himself that was the reason. It was Mallory. The night before, after the welcome dinner, they'd walk back to the suite under the stars. She'd teased him about his stiff smile, poked fun at the oyster appetizers, and even managed to get him to laugh, really laugh, for the first time in weeks. And when she'd said goodnight and disappeared into her room, he'd stood there for 10 full seconds wondering what the hell he was doing. She was supposed to be temporary, a date, a decoy, but she wasn't just that anymore. "Big day," Mallory said, interrupting his thoughts as she stepped back inside. He looked up. Her hair was still damp from the shower, and she wore one of the hotel's plush robes. She looked relaxed, effortlessly beautiful. "Yeah," he muttered. "You sure you're okay going through with this charade?" She arched an eyebrow. "If you're asking whether I'm nervous about facing a room full of people judging me while pretending to be your girlfriend, the answer is, yeah, a little. But I said I'd do this, so I'm doing it." He smiled. "I'm glad." The wedding ceremony was held at an old church downtown, ornate, historical, and overflowing with white roses. Mallory sat beside Jordan near the front, her arm lightly resting against his. They didn't talk much. The ceremony was beautiful. Claire cried as she read her vows. Jordan couldn't help but feel something twist in his chest. After the ceremony, the guests filed into the reception hall next door, which had been transformed into a floral wonderland with soft lighting, champagne towers, and a live string quartet. Jordan and Mallory were seated at one of the center tables, close enough to the action that they couldn't escape notice. People came by in waves. "So how long have you two been dating? How did you meet? Mallory, are you in finance too?" Jordan answered the first few, but Mallory handled the rest like a pro. "We met by accident," she'd say, and it was true in its own way. "Finance? No, I work with people," she added, vague enough to sound impressive, but true to her old volunteer work at shelters. After a while, the line between fiction and reality blurred. Jordan watched her laugh with strangers, charm skeptical aunts, and even compliment Claire's wedding dress without a trace of bitterness. She wasn't just fitting in, she was shining. As the first dance started, Jordan leaned over and whispered, "Want to dance?" Mallory looked at him, eyes searching. "Are we still pretending?" He paused. "I don't know." She took his hand. "Let's find out." They moved to the dance floor, his hand on her back, hers on his shoulder. The music played, and everything else faded. In that moment, it didn't feel like a performance anymore. Mallory had never danced like that before. Not in a ballroom, not under chandeliers, and definitely not with someone like Jordan Hayes. His touch was gentle but steady, his gaze locked on hers like they were the only two people in the room. For a while, she forgot they were pretending. But the moment ended when Claire walked by, holding 2 champagne flutes and trailing behind her new husband. She stopped, smiled too widely and said, "You two look cozy." Jordan stepped back slightly, putting space between himself and Mallory. "Just enjoying the music," he said evenly. Claire handed him a glass. "I hope you're really happy, Jordan. I always worried you'd get stuck in that glass tower of yours, alone with your spreadsheets." He forced a smile. "Thanks, Claire. Really." Mallory watched Claire's eyes flick between them, as if trying to read between the lines. After Claire walked away, Mallory turned to Jordan. "She's not over you." Jordan let out a dry laugh. "She's married now. Doesn't mean she's over it." He didn't reply, but his jaw tightened. They returned to the table, and the night wore on with more dancing, more wine, more polite conversation. But something shifted in Jordan after that moment. He grew distant. Mallory noticed the way his smiles became mechanical again, his responses short. Back at the suite later, Mallory kicked off her shoes and walked onto the balcony while Jordan poured himself a drink. "So," she said, leaning on the railing, "are we going to talk about it?" He didn't look at her. "Talk about what?" "Claire, the way you looked at her today, the way she looked at you." Jordan sighed and sat down. "I thought I was over her. I thought showing up with someone else would make me feel better. But standing there, watching her promise forever to someone else. I felt like a fool. "You're not a fool," Mallory said softly, "but you are still hurt." He looked up at her, and for the first time since she met him, she saw it, his vulnerability. "I gave her everything," he said. "My time, my loyalty. I built a life I thought she'd want to be a part of. But it wasn't enough. I wasn't enough." Mallory crossed the room and sat beside him. "Or maybe she just wasn't right for you." He glanced at her, eyes tired. "And what about you, Mallory? Who were you before the corner deli?" She smiled faintly. "A nursing student. Dropped out when my mom got sick. Spent the next 2 years taking care of her. When she passed, I just drifted." He stared at her. "Why didn't you tell me? You didn't ask. I was just supposed to be a date, remember?" Silence fell between them, heavy but not cold. Then Jordan said, "I think I'd like to know more." Mallory met his gaze. "Then ask." It wasn't a fairy tale moment. There were no fireworks, just two broken people sitting in the quiet, letting their masks slip for the first time. And for Jordan, that was more real than anything he'd felt in years. The morning after the wedding, the Charleston sun rose quietly over the marsh, casting a golden hue across the water. Mallory stood barefoot on the porch with a mug of black coffee, her hair still tousled from sleep. She had expected to feel out of place here every moment, but instead she felt calm. Inside, Jordan emerged from his room looking more relaxed than usual. No suit, no tie, just joggers and a plain t-shirt. He looked younger somehow, lighter. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she replied, handing him a second cup. They sat together in the quiet for a few minutes, watching egrets glide over the reeds. Then Jordan broke the silence. "I think I owe you a real thank you." "For what?" she asked. "For saying yes. For being better at this than I ever expected. For being honest, even when I wasn't." Mallory smiled, not quite meeting his eyes. "You weren't so bad yourself, Mr. Hayes." They both laughed quietly. Their flight wasn't until that evening, so they decided to take a walk through the historic downtown. Mallory had never seen live oaks like that, draped in moss, their thick roots rising through brick sidewalks. She stopped in front of a small bookstore with a cat in the window and looked in longingly. "You want to go in?" Jordan asked. She hesitated. "We don't have to." He pulled the door open. "I think we do." Inside, she wandered the aisles slowly, pausing at a table of used paperbacks. Jordan watched her, amazed at how different she was from anyone he'd ever dated. She wasn't flashy or eager to impress. She wasn't drawn to expensive labels or exclusive clubs. She was drawn to stories. They ended up in the back corner, sitting on a faded bench, flipping through a poetry book. Mallory read a few lines softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Jordan wasn't even listening to the words, just the way she spoke them. "You know," he said gently, "I don't want this to end when we get back to New York." Mallory closed the book slowly, then looked up at him. "You mean the charade?" "I mean us." A long pause. "Jordan," she said, "this started because you didn't want to be alone at a wedding. I know, but somewhere between you wearing that navy dress and dancing with me under twinkle lights, I stopped thinking about Claire. I started thinking about you." Mallory's expression softened. "I'm not like the women in your world. I don't have degrees or family money or an Ivy League resume." "Good," he said. "I've had all that, and I was miserable." They walked out of the bookstore hand in hand. No photographers, no audience, just two people stumbling into something real. That evening, as the plane lifted off from Charleston and the city lights faded behind them, Jordan reached over and took her hand again. This time, not as a performance. This time because he wanted to. Back in New York, the streets were colder, faster, louder, but something between Jordan and Mallory had changed. Gone was the awkward silence, the strained formality. Now their conversations flowed easily. They moved around each other like people who had known one another much longer than a few days. Jordan's apartment, a sleek, modern penthouse with glass walls, felt less intimidating to Mallory now. The city's chaos didn't overwhelm her like it used to. Maybe it was because, for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was surviving. She felt like she was starting to live again. Jordan invited her to stay for a while. Just until she got on her feet, he said. But they both knew it was more than that. 1 week turned into 2. Jordan adjusted his meetings around her volunteer hours at the downtown women's shelter. Mallory started cooking dinner some nights, experimenting with recipes she'd never had time to try. They fell into an easy rhythm, coffee in the mornings, wine in the evenings, and long, honest talks in between. He opened up about his childhood, about how his parents had expected greatness, and how failure was never an option. She told him about her mother's last days, how helpless she'd felt watching someone she loved fade away. They cried once, together, late at night on the couch, and it brought them closer than any kiss could have. Still, Mallory had doubts. One night, she stood in front of Jordan's floor-to-ceiling windows, arms crossed, staring out at the city. "Do you think this is real?" she asked quietly. Jordan looked up from the couch. "What do you mean?" "This, United States. What if it's just a leftover fantasy from Charleston? What if we were just playing pretend so well that we fooled ourselves?" He walked over and took her hand. "I don't care how it started. I know how I feel now. And I know it's real because I don't want to go back to the way things were before I met you." She turned toward him, her voice barely audible. "I'm scared, Jordan." "So am I," he whispered, "but I'm more scared of letting you walk out that door." A tear slipped down her cheek and she let out a quiet laugh. "Wow, for a guy who used me as wedding armor, you sure got deep." He grinned. "You've been messing up my perfect plans since the moment you walked into that lobby." She kissed him then, soft and slow, like a promise. Weeks later, Jordan introduced her at a gala, not as his date or his +1, but as his partner. Mallory had found a new job back in nursing and was starting night classes to finish what she'd left behind. He was proud of her, endlessly so, and she, in turn, reminded him what it felt like to have purpose beyond power and wealth. Their love hadn't come from a meet-cute or a romantic comedy. It started as a lie to get through a wedding. But somehow, in the middle of tuxedos and borrowed dresses, between glances meant to fool and dances meant to distract, they'd found something real, and neither of them ever wanted to pretend again. What began as a staged date to save face at an ex's wedding turned into something neither Jordan nor Mallory expected. Genuine connection, healing, and love. In pretending to be a couple, they uncovered truths about themselves, faced their pasts, and found something real in the most unlikely place. Sometimes what starts as a charade ends up being the most honest thing of all. If you enjoyed this heartfelt story of unexpected love, second chances, and breaking down emotional walls, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful narratives. Got a favorite story you'd like retold? Drop it in the comments below.